Let's see.
YouTube, Facebook, both live.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to TLC Live. I'm Andrea Gomez, and I hope everybody survived the nightmare of the storm that hit Texas last week. Orlando is joining us from Midland, Odessa, Orlando. You living by myself today. What is going on? What are you doing
I
there?
did, but well, we're meeting with conservatives in Lubbock and Midland, Odessa, tomorrow in El Paso. A lot of wonderful people here, a lot of hardworking conservatives, including a big population of Latinos that are working in the oil patch. And so we're just taking the message of the Texas Latino conservatives on the road and introducing ourselves to a lot of fine folks up here in the High Plains and the South Plains of Texas.
How did you did last week? How did you survive? Because it was really hard for me. I lost power on February 15. I woke up Monday without power, and then Tuesday I didn't have water. Through the whole week, I got power back on Thursday and also water back on Friday with a low pressure. And I know we met on a Wednesday. You were so kind, bringing food to me and my friends because it was no restaurants open and it was really hard to cook without electricity. So thank you so much for that, Orlando. So how did you do through the whole week? Because it was really tough week for everybody in Texas.
Well, Andrea, I think I was fortunate in the sense that, and I can't answer this. I'm only speculating. Maybe David can help us. Our guest that's going to be up here in just a moment. I think I'm on a circuit in Houston. I never lost power. I did lose water pressure, but fortunately, I had several gallons of water at home, so I did okay. I was fortunate. My heart really was breaking for the millions of Texans that were suffering in this incredibly cold weather without heat, and then to make matters worse, without water. So, by the grace of God, I did okay, but it still didn't make me feel any better that my fellow Houstonians and my fellow Texans were suffering.
Definitely. I saw many stories and we were like trying to follow everything that was going on the news and on social media, and people that we know, family, relatives, and friends of our family, and friends just in general, and people that we know that they were really suffering. At least 30 people passed away because of this storm, and we're still going through many things. It was a lot of damage, but after this historical storm, that's something that we never face in our life here in Texas. It's more questions than answers. So that's why we invited today to our show to David Roylance. He is a principal at Prism Energy Solutions, and he also has 30 years of experience in the public sector and private sector. And that's why we want to talk to him, because he's an expert in this industry, and we want to, kind of have a sense of what happened last week, why we face this in the energy capital of the world. And I can understand these situations when you're coming from a third world country like me in Colombia. We have an energy crisis in 1992 all the way till 1993. We were facing blackouts for the entire year, where it was caused by El Nino. And you can understand those situations maybe in the third world country, but not in the energy capital of the world, especially here in Texas, that we're living this situation. It's very unbelievable. So welcome, David, to our TLC Live. Thank you so much for your time. I know you are in Boston and you're working right now, but you are giving us an hour of your time to talk about this situation that also you faced last week, because you were here in Houston. You live by Bel Air. So how things were doing in your area?
Yes, thank you, Andre and Orlando. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to echo both your comments. Last week was tragic, and it affected our entire community, and there are many Texans that suffered greatly. I was not quite as fortunate as Orlando, and maybe a little more fortunate than you, Andrea, but we lost power for about 20 hours. We dealt with low water pressure, the boil water effect for a few days, but we're fortunate enough to get through without much damage. What an unprecedented event! Just hard to comprehend that this type of event could affect Texas, as you point out, the energy capital of the world. But at its core, this was a incredible weather event, and it certainly exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, many unimaginable, many, I think, as the studies play out and time passes, many could have been prevented, and we can certainly talk about those as this conversation matures.
David, thank you for taking some time out of your day to be with us. Obviously, I come at things from a political perspective, and not to drag you into politics, but I just want to make a comment. The finger pointing and the blame game started almost immediately. The people on the conservative side, were blaming the Green New Deal. The people on the liberal side were complaining and blaming it on the reliance on one or two energy sources. Let me just say this, and Andrea may be too young to know this, but in the 1970s, we had an energy crisis in the United States where the entire country was asked to participate in rolling brownouts and potentially blackouts. We had lines for gasoline that stretched on end for miles in major cities in America. And in fact, it was so bad that you couldn't buy gasoline unless your license plate ended either on a even number or an odd number. So energy crises are not new to this country. The important thing, David, is that we learn from them, and what do we do moving forward? I think as a consequence of the Jimmy Carter era and the energy crises back then, when we were totally dependent on Middle Eastern energy, particularly crude, is that we then developed what's called the strategic petroleum reserves. These are massive underground caverns where, for military and domestic reasons, we store billions of barrels of oil. We then became energy independent, and it took several decades to do it. But what I'm hoping, David, is that we learn from this and that we move forward, and that we don't, spend our entire children's future on the answer, but certainly there are things we can do to fortify the system, right?
Absolutely. Orlando, Texas is blessed. I know last week it didn't feel like it, but we are at the intersection of a wealth of oil and gas reserves. The innovation that you're experiencing being out in Midland, Odessa today, the innovation that has moved us to be largely independent is incredible. And I hope that that momentum continues. On the electricity side, what we all experienced last week, we too in Texas are going through an energy transformation. The Texas grid is one of the most diverse grids in the United States, probably for that matter in the world. We are blessed with wind resources. We are blessed with traditional oil and gas resources, lignite. We have a few nuclear plants in the mix. So, from a diversity standpoint, this is an incredible place to be. And quite frankly, politics are not going to solve this problem. When you look at what happened in Texas last week, at its, in my opinion, it was about weatherization. Our entire system is built for what we're all very familiar with, which is a very warm August day. And the entire infrastructure from the generating plants that create the electricity to the transmission wires that distribute that, all the way through to your meter that's attached to your house or apartment. Those were largely designed to accommodate an extreme heat. When you get a polar vortex, which is essentially an enormous cold air mass that comes down from the north, particularly the Arctic Circle, the systems are not prepared. And because we did not have the necessary weatherization, we had pipelines that had low pressure due to freeze-offs. We had wind turbines that had icicles hanging from them that made them inoperable. We had coal stacks that were frozen solid. So the issue really comes down to weatherization. And sadly, it's not the first time. When I first encountered this issue was back in the late 80s. We had a very cold winter event in Texas, and some of the weatherization issues came up then. In 2011, which was a difficult year, in February of 2011, we had extreme cold, had freeze-offs, and then we had the extreme heat in August of that same year. So unfortunately, I think we know the problem. And the problem is, how do we appropriately weatherize a system? And how do we do that cost effectively so that we're not paying for investments that are rarely used or needed for too long a period? So I would say that's kind of to me, the first takeaway. The other one is going to be a conversation around reliability. Those of us that experienced the power outages are now left asking, well, what is the acceptable amount of outage that we're willing to tolerate? A quick answer would be, I don't ever want to experience an outage, but the cost of that type of decision is almost unmanageable. And so I think the other part of this conversation will be around what is an appropriate reliability. But at its very core, this is about weatherization. We lost natural gas fueled power stations. We lost coal powered fuel stations. We lost wind generating units, generally because unlike a typical Arctic storm that will start to the north and pass to the south, and so as the south is experiencing cold, the north is recovering. This particular polar vortex, in some aspects, like Hurricane Harvey, just sat on top of our state for a prolonged period, and the systems were not designed to accommodate that.
David, what has to do this situation that this era that we're living, and everybody's talking about the green energy, That has to do something what we faced last week, and I was telling you guys before we went off the on the air that I was reading an article from Ron Paul, and he was saying, I guess if you want to make a Green New Deal omelet, you have to break a few eggs. So put it as a perspective, the impact of the green energy.
Yeah, Andrea, thank you for that. I mentioned earlier that Texas and really the broader U.S. is in an energy transformation. The traditional model of coal-fired power stations or natural gas-powered stations is changing, and we are seeing renewable become a more concentrated portion of the electricity mix. In Texas, in 2021, we are forecast to get about 30% of our energy from renewable resources, which is incredible considering that, less than 10 years ago, that number was more like 4 or 5%. So renewables are an ever increasing part of the grid, and sustainability is important, but it cannot exist in isolation. And what last week exposed was that, yes, we did have some renewable generators that failed. The most prominent example being, ice on wind blades up in the Panhandle, snow covering solar panels in the north part of the state. But we had an equal amount, in fact, some studies show even a larger amount of what we call thermal generation that was offline. And that was the natural gas and coal units that were also affected by the weather. But from my perspective, renewable is becoming increasingly attractive. And it's going to be part of the solution, but the solution is not going entirely renewable. It's having the right mix and then having reliability in the form of either redundant assets or other types of controls that can help us navigate these extreme weather events. Today, battery technology, batteries look optimistic in helping us with short-term power constraints. Today, a battery is effective, unfortunately, just for a few hours at large scale. But I'm optimistic in the coming years that we'll see batteries that can be charged at times of the day when there's not as much demand, and then discharged back into the grid when there are these peak events. And hopefully that can last for hours and maybe even days versus short term. So Texas is definitely in a transition. Renewable is becoming more and more attractive from an economic standpoint. The obligation for the policyholders and the policymakers is to basically now focus on reliability, focus on weatherization, and create the right incentives so that these diverse sources, wind, solar, battery, natural gas, nuclear, coal, can coexist and create a reliable grid for all of us. I mean, Texas is growing. We're growing in terms of population, but what we call electrification is growing even faster. All of us are carrying phones and charging computers and smart TVs, and so our electric use as a populace is outpacing even population growth. So we're going to need renewable, we're going to need traditional resources, and we're going to need to focus on the reliability so that they can accommodate extreme hot and extreme cold events.
David, you bring up an interesting point, and I think that you shared with me an article from an industry newsletter, and I thought there was a great quotation in there about in the airline industry when there's a disaster, and we all agree that the failure of the electric power generation in Texas was a disaster. but there's never one cause. It's called the chain of the accident, right? It could be poor training, poor decision making by personnel, poor maintenance, poor decision making, contribute to an airline crash. Uh, I think the same thing happened in Texas with respect to the energy electric production. It was not one thing. It was not the failure of reliance on coal. It was not the failure of the reliance on natural gas, or the reliance on nuclear, or the reliance on hydro, as you mentioned, or the green alternative sources like solar and wind. It was a combination of all of them. Now, having said all that, I think you mentioned the word reliability, and that means that a lot of Texans were watching TV Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and everyone was blaming ERCOT. Now I'm gonna be um, I'm gonna be a little kinder to ERCOT. ERCOT is the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, right? And they don't
Yes.
produce anything. They're basically a traffic cop. If you can think of a busy intersection in a major city and there's a police officer or a couple police officers directing traffic, you go this so there are no crashes. The same thing happens in the electric grid. You have to manage the grid so that there are no crashes. So I think it was unfair for ERCOT to take the brunt of the blame. Now, having said all that, and you talked about this, um, we did experience rolling brownouts and blackouts during the extreme heat in Texas. That should tell us that our capacity for generation during peak temperatures is lacking. And part of the problem is, I want to know if you agree with that. And I guess the second part is, how easy is it to get a power plant permitted? If you want to use coal, I mean, I'm sure we're not doing coal fired plants anymore, but natural gas, which is, in my opinion, a wise use of our natural resource. As I told you, I'm out here in Midland and I was driving in from Lubbock. And folks, if you haven't been out here, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of pipes burning off natural gas. We're swimming in natural gas. I think natural gas is a great way to produce electricity. But how long does it take to get a permit for a power plant from the federal government and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality?
I don't know if we lost David. David, are you with us? We can,
Seem to have lost your
David. I
audio,
think
David.
David. Yeah, you mute yourself, David. If you can unmute yourself. Hold on. Let's see if David can.
He kind of looks like me working a computer, right?
I know,
He's
I know, I know. You
he's trying to
guys.
figure things.
David, do you
Uh,
unmute yourself? Do we have a David in number, Mark? Oh, but probably he's on the phone.
You can try to call
well,
him.
anyway, let me tell you
Okay,
what we've been
Orlando,
doing up here in
something that
Lubbock and
people were
Midland area.
asking, people were asking through the whole week, and when we start losing water and water pressure, we're pretty much clueless of this situation, what is going on. So, what it has to do water with electricity? I mean, we lost electricity, and then what we lost
Well,
water to?
yeah. So it's in my I try to make it as simple as I can. If you've ever driven through small towns in Texas or any place in the country, you'll see these massive water towers, right?
Yeah,
And those water towers put pressure on the municipal water system so that when you open your faucet, that pressure in that tower, 150, 200 feet up in the air,
yeah,
provides the pressure for you to get water. But in Houston, many, 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 many years ago, we quit building water towers and started building water pumps. We put everything, underground, whether it was pumping stations for purified water or whether there were lift stations for raw sewage. And so the power for the pumps comes from electricity.
mm,
And when the electricity went out, the pumps couldn't work. If the pumps don't work, the water pressure to your house drops, I think, below 30 or 20 psi, which is required by the Texas Commission on Environmental quality to keep bacteria and other particles out of the water. And so, again, Andrea, it wasn't one thing, it was a cascade of several things, right? First, you have frozen pipelines in West Texas, you have frozen wind turbines, you have frozen coal piles. Now you don't have enough power to run the pumps for water, and it was a disaster.
Yeah. Okay. We have David back. I don't know if David, if you hear Orlando's question. If
Okay.
not, let us know so that way Orlando can ask the question again.
No, I did. Thank you, Andrea. I wanted to start by echoing Orlando's comments on ERCOT. I think ERCOT did under very difficult circumstances, did a very good job of navigating the crisis. ERCOT is to use the airline example, they're an air traffic controller. So they are coordinating the roughly 700 power stations that generate electricity and the millions of consumers that then use that electricity. They're just trying to clear the process. The decision around blackouts or brownouts is really made at the local level. So for those of us in the Houston area, that's CenterPoint Energy. If you're in the north part of the state, Dallas, you're dealing with Encore. The decisions of how to implement the blackouts or brownouts is made at the utility level, and Texas is unique. We operate different models across our state. Orlando, you mentioned you'll be in El Paso. El Paso is actually a regulated area that has interfaces with the western states. You get up north around Abilene and Lubbock, you're dealing with, ties into the Colorado system. So, it would be easy to blame where we are today on our market model. But the fact is, we have multiple market models and they were all under stress. So the issue does become, how do we build adequate generating resources? And Texas historically has been very favorable to business, and this is a state where you could build new generating plants. But back to the political context, it's becoming more difficult. People don't want a generating plant in their backyard. The regulatory process is less friendly. TCEQ, will put fairly stringent rules in place about emissions and siting. So while it will take probably to plan, justify, and implement a power station can be done in less than 2 years, particularly if you're talking about a gas unit, which I would say is a fairly quick solution, but it's certainly not overnight. And it is becoming more difficult because also in Texas, while it felt very acute for those that lost power last week, and when it's very hot in August, the majority of the days of a year, we have in excess of 30% extra generation, because we have this summer peak, or we have a February peak, but on a day in, day out basis, there's a lot of generating plants that sit idle. And that goes back to my point of, yes, we can build more power stations, but we've then got to have a system in place that can make them reliable and economic, so that they're there when we need them. Now, some folks.
I just want to say, I don't know, I'm not sorry to interrupt, but in the
No, you're good.
summertime, David, we have, and I'm not an expert in the industry, so I'm asking. We have what's called peakers in the state of Texas, right? These are generation plants that don't really operate year round, but in the summertime when the demand's real high, they turn them on, and that's why they're called peakers. They use their electricity during the peak times. Um, a lot of people that I knew a little bit about it, were asking me, well, why don't we just turn on these plants that are idle? And I try to explain to people, you can't just walk down the street and turn a key and and fire up a power plant. It's just not that easy. Am I right?
Well, yes and no. The right part is that yes, we do have peakers, and I think we should put more in place. But the reality is, some of those peakers operate on natural gas, and unfortunately, the system, what I call the straw, the pipelines, weren't big enough to accommodate the incremental need for natural gas. As a state,
Gotcha.
we use natural gas in the winter to heat our homes, to heat our factories and buildings. And then we use natural gas in the summer to power our power stations. Well, what happened in February is we needed to heat homes and power generating stations. And the straws just weren't big enough. And those that were big enough were facing low pressure because of the cold weather, the freeze offs. So we definitely peakers will be part of the solution. As you talk about, this is a multi-step, multi-dimension fix, and some of those peakers will probably need to be diesel, because you'll need to have different fuel sources that power that. And I mentioned batteries earlier. Batteries, in some aspects, serve as a peaker, right? They can, for a few critical hours, discharge and help with the grid.
I'm gonna read a question that we have from one of our viewers. Says Jason Jones. He say energy reserves got down to 4%, and which is inexcusable. Why are we subsidizing wind, solar to such a large extent?
Yeah, great question. So reserves, I talked about that 30%. That's an example of reserves. What that means is we had generation that was available, and it was more than what was required on that day. When you get in these stress periods, as the caller points out, that reserve margin shrank down to single digits. And in fact, because we had outages, actually went negative, meaning we didn't have enough generators to meet what would have been the demand had people not lost power at their homes. Some of renewable, to me, that's an example of kind of political influence. And from my perspective, initially to incent investments in creating a more diverse generation mix, or incenting initial investments in areas that would otherwise have a hard time getting started, I think that's a productive ground. What we tend to forget is at some point, when that critical mass and it can produce its own economics, those incentives need to go away, and they need to be redirected to other resources. So I would say that the incentives were important to allow us to bring on some new generating resources. And again, I think it's important that we have a mix. But over time, those incentives should decline as assets, in this case, wind or solar, prove that they're economic on a standalone basis. But just like with battery, or just like with new technology and quick start generators, whether they be natural gas, those are areas where I'd like to see some incentives, as long as they are short-lived and really follow the term. They're incentives to get started. They're not incentives to stay in business forever.
One last question, David. We're going to let you go, and we appreciate your time again. One of the famous congresswomen from Houston took to the microphones without naming names and said that she was going to call her friends in New York and California and get some power down to Texas. What's the feasibility of doing that? In other words, do we have the connectivity to get power from New York and California into Texas? And I know people are going to say, well, if you guys wouldn't have ERCOT and you were interconnected to the federal system where the feds would govern Texas, you would. Talk to us a little bit about that. Can we get power from New York and California?
Well, there's so much wrong with that statement, Orlando. I don't know where to start. Texas doesn't need help from New York. I think we can all agree on that. So Texas does have some interconnection to other grids. The Mid-Atlantic ISO, which includes parts of East Texas. We have another grid system called SPP to the north. The fact of the matter is this. This storm basically ran through Texas all the way up into New York. And so the first question I would have is, so are you suggesting that we take and turn lights off in Little Rock so that we can have power in Texarkana or Dallas? That's just not a practical solution. The other piece is a polar vortex went through the Northeast in 2014. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they lost power. They had pipelines freeze off. They had exactly the same issue. And so I would much rather Texas deal with Texas issues than find ourselves dealing with a blackout because something happened in another state that quite honestly wouldn't help. And those grids were also under different levels of stress. So I think just on its surface, it's not a factual. It's a good headline, but it's not a factual reality.
Yeah, but what's amazing to me is the ferocity with which the local media covered these comments, and not one person bothered to ask, is that possible, Congresswoman? Do you really expect the Bronx to turn off their lights so they can help Texas? I mean, come on. This is the ridiculousness of, the media, and you don't have to comment. This is my opinion time. This is the
Oh, I'm
ridiculousness.
nodding. I'm nodding my head. I don't know if you can
Yeah.
see me.
No,
So.
I mean, I'm not going to name names, but the local media was absolutely clueless that this congresswoman was really going to go on a shopping spree and get his power from California and New York. I mean, for God's sake. Anyway, I've got a meeting. Thank you, David. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Stay
Orlando.
safe and warm up in
Yeah.
Boston. We'll see you when you get back home.
Yep.
Andre, I'll see you next week when I get it home, and you can bid everyone a farewell from the studio. Back
Don't
to
leave
you.
me sola otra vez. David,
Yeah.
gracias. David, muchísimas gracias por haber estado con nosotros. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and it was a very, very good information that you gave us today.
No, thank you.
Okay, Orlando, we'll have fun. I'll see you next week.
All right, take care. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. And please follow us and, like us this video, share this video if you like the information that we give you every week. Follow us here at the Texas Latino Conservatives social media. Also, please join us in the TexasLatinoConservatives.com, TexasLatinoConservatives.com. Become a member. It's only $35 a year. Become a member. Be part of this family. Be part of the education and engagement that we doing every week, but also our goals and our vision with this community, the conservative community, because that's what we want. We want to be your voice. We want to be part of you. We want to highlight the values that we come in, our Latinos values, and we want you to be part of our community and help us to help. And also, I want to congratulate one of our dear friends, and I'm going to read everything that she wrote on Facebook because this is amazing. She's not only a dear friend of us, but she's part of the alumni for the Leadership Latino here at one of the programs that we have in the Texas Latino Conservatives. So, Mayra Flores, if you watching us today, I want to congratulate you, from the bottom of our heart here at the Texas Latino Conservatives. She did a major announcement. She said, I'm excited to announce my congressional run after guidance from my closest friends, family, and ultimate God. I feel it's the right time. Today, I officially announce that I am running for Congress in District 34. Democrats have taken for granted the loyalty and support South Texas has given them for decades. They do nothing to earn our vote or our support. It's time to conservative leadership. We can flip this pivotal seat, but I can do it without your help and support. Will you consider it? Well, she's asking for help. She's asking for donation. And if you want to follow Mayra Flores on Facebook, she has all the announcement and she has all the links and all the events that she's going to be, and we're also going to have, Mayra, if you're watching us, send us a video telling us about why you decide to run for this position. What is your platform? What is your vision with this position once you win this position? Because I'm sure you're going to do it. People love you over there. We love you, and we really appreciate that you became one of the voices for your community, not only for the Latino community in Texas, but the community over there in South Texas. So, Mayra Flores, congratulations, and I hope we see you soon. And also, if you want to check Mayra first advertising and first commercial is also in our page, in a Facebook page, in the Texas Latino Conservatives. It's just, if you go just to our page, it's a video, and it's Mayra Flores there. She's playing a granddaughter talking about conservatives' value with the grandma. So, congratulations again. Felicitaciones, Mayra. Un beso, un abrazo desde aquí, desde Houston, y por supuesto de tu familia en The Texas Latino Conservatives. Así que, pues, muchas gracias a todos ustedes por habernos acompañado el día de hoy. Esperamos que hayan sobrevivido todo este caos y esta crisis que sufrimos la semana pasada, con todo lo que ocurrió con esta tormenta que vivimos en el estado de Texas. Por supuesto, que todavía se puedan seguir recuperando, porque sabemos que muchísima gente todavía tiene techos dañados, muchas tuberías dañadas. Se está tratando de arreglar todos los daños, pero lo más importante es que tenemos vida. So what I was saying is, like, I hope you guys went through this and survived this crisis and this nightmare that we were facing last week. And I know so many people are still dealing with pipes and dealing with roofs and all the damage that it caused this storm in your houses. But the most important thing is that we are alive, and please keep your family safe, and let's go through this together. So Texas, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next Wednesday in another TLC Live here at 11 más o menos. Hopefully Orlando is going to join me next week. And remember, please go to TexasLatinoConservatives.com and become part of the family. Nos vemos la próxima semana. Chao, chao.